This story begins with arrogance and prejudice and ends in deafening silence. An industry tycoon, used to wielding power to humiliate, demanded that his black maid play the violin in front of everyone, certain it would be a ridiculous spectacle. What he didn't count on was the talent she hid beneath her uniform. What was meant to be a humiliation turned into a performance that silenced the entire room and shattered the boss's ego. Have you ever seen someone turn the tables like that, fueled by courage and raw talent? Tell us in the comments. This story goes beyond music. It's about respect, resilience, and the sound that echoes when truth speaks louder. Charlotte's World. The Blackwood Mansion wasn't just a place, it was a monster. A monster made of stone and oppressive silence, where every step Charlotte took didn't echo on the polished marble floor, but inside her very soul. To her, it wasn't a home, but a daily battlefield, where dignity was her only weapon and exhaustion the constant enemy. Charlotte was a necessary shadow, part of the furniture, invisible to the eyes that wanted her that way, yet essential to the rhythm of life in the mansion. Her days began before the sun even dared peek through the heavy curtains. The scent of fresh coffee, the soft clink of porcelain, the whisper of brushes gliding over the Persian carpet, these were the sounds that marked her mornings. She was the one who organized other people's chaos, who made sure the gleam of the crystal chandeliers outshined even the faintest trace of dust. With every task, Charlotte felt the weight not just of labor, but of indifference, a cold, calculated kind of indifference that crept through the cracks of closed doors and in the eyes that looked right through her. But Charlotte was there, and she felt everything. She felt the subtle humiliation in every command delivered in a tone barely above a whisper, yet heavy with unquestionable authority. She felt the loneliness that filled the hallways at night, after the guests had left and Mr. Blackwood had retreated to his private wing. It was in those moments, when the mansion's silence became its heaviest, that Charlotte sought her refuge. And her refuge had a name: Violin. Hidden inside a dark wooden case at the back of her small attic room, the violin wasn't just an instrument, it was a portal to memories of her grandmother, with strong, calloused hands guiding her tiny fingers across the strings, teaching her the language of notes, the melody of life. It was the echo of laughter, of gatherings where music filled the air and warmed hearts, of a life where she was seen, loved, and her voice, even if musical, mattered. Through the violin, Charlotte found her voice, the one the Blackwood Mansion tried to silence. She played in secret, under the dim light of a small lamp, with the door carefully closed so that not even a whisper of melody would escape and break the silence the mansion demanded. It was a sacred ritual, a way for her to reconnect with who she truly was, beyond the maid, beyond the shadow. The strings vibrated under her fingers, and the notes filled the small room with an emotion that clashed violently with the dryness of the floor below. Up here, she wasn't the maid, Charlotte. She was simply Charlotte, the music, the soul. Each melody was a reminder that her essence couldn't be bought, broken, or diminished by the empty luxury that surrounded her. The violin was her shield and her sword, her prayer and her lullaby. It was living proof that no matter how much they tried to steal her from herself, something essential within her remained untouched, unbreakable. Mr. Blackwood. Ah, Mr. Blackwood. He was the embodiment of the mansion, imposing, cold, and seemingly emotionless. His presence was like a draft of icy wind sweeping through the halls, making everyone inside stiffen and grow more rigid. He was a businessman, an industry tycoon whose decisions shook markets and whose words were law in his empire. But inside his own home, the law was silence, perfection, and the invisibility of those who served him. Charlotte rarely saw him. When she did, it was to receive a monosyllabic order or a look that made her feel even smaller than she already did. He was a man who seemed to have traded every trace of humanity for power and control, and that power he wielded over everyone, including Charlotte, without ever noticing the beauty she secretly carried within her. Her world was gray, heavy, but at night, the violin brought vibrant colors, notes that painted a different sky above her small attic room, a sky that only she could see. It was an act of quiet resistance, a promise she made to herself that she would never fully lose who she was in the emptiness of that mansion. The central conflict, the humiliating order. The Blackwood mansion was in one of its rare moments of liveliness, not the joyful kind, but a showcase of status. Mr. Blackwood was entertaining investors and business partners, the elite, who floated through the rooms with glasses of whiskey and calculated smiles. Even their soft voices seemed to scrape against the silence that Charlotte worked so hard to preserve. She moved among the guests like a ghost, her polished tray catching the chandelier's glow, while her eyes, which no one noticed, quietly recorded the opulence and the distance. It was near the end of the night, after most of the guests had already left, that the request came. Mr. Blackwood, who had barely acknowledged her until that point, stood in the center of the grand hall, eyes fixed on Charlotte as she gathered the last of the empty glasses. The already thin air seemed to thicken instantly. He didn't smile. There was no kindness in his expression, just a cold, almost bored curiosity. Charlotte. His voice was deep, and the simple sound of her name coming from his mouth struck like a silent thunderclap. She froze, the tray trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands. "I heard you play the violin." The sentence, so simple, tore through the veil of her invisibility, exposing her most carefully guarded secret. Charlotte felt a chill crawl down her spine. Her mind raced to the small attic room, to the violin, her safe harbor. How did he know? Had someone heard her? Had someone told him? It didn't matter. That secret, her refuge, was now exposed to the mansion's cruel light. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper, struggling to maintain composure. Her eyes dropped, searching for the safety of the marble floor. Mr. Blackwood smiled, but it wasn't a smile of delight. It was the smile of power, laced with a faint touch of cruelty. "Interesting. Playing for the help upstairs isn't quite the same as playing for an audience, is it, Charlotte?" He paused, his eyes locked on her, a predator assessing his prey. "Tomorrow night, during dinner, you'll play for me, and for a few guests." The words landed on Charlotte like stones. The humiliation, the intention was as sharp and clear as a scalpel's blade. It wasn't an invitation to perform, it was a command to put on a show for mockery. He wanted to see her there, exposed, vulnerable, her talent, her passion, reduced to mere entertainment for him and his circle. He wanted to belittle her, to remind her, and everyone, of the distance between his world and hers. The violin, once her shield, would become her shackle. Anger bubbled in her chest, a burning flame she struggled to contain. Anger at him, at the indifference, at the injustice. But beneath the anger lay something even deeper: pain. He wasn't just asking her to play, he was demanding that she defile her art, cast it down before an audience that would never understand the soul behind the notes. It was a violation of her spirit, an insult to the memory of her grandmother. That night, Charlotte couldn't play. The violin felt too heavy, the strings too silent. She sat at the edge of her bed, her hands resting gently on the instrument, as if trying to shield it from an imminent threat. Her mind spun. How could she do this? How could she play something so intimate, so sacred, under Blackwood's mocking gaze? The thought of being ridiculed, of having her very essence laid bare, only to be dismissed, was nearly unbearable. And then came the memories. Her grandmother sitting on the porch, sunlight filtering through the leaves as soft violin notes floated through the air. "Music, my dear," her grandmother used to say, eyes sparkling, "is the voice of the soul. It's what connects us to what's beautiful, to what's strong, to what is ours. No one can ever take that from you." Her grandmother's voice was a balm, but also a reminder of the responsibility she carried toward her art. And now Mr. Blackwood was demanding that she betray that voice, to turn it into a mockery. The anguish tightened in her chest. Every movement within the mansion, every step from the other servants, every muffled sound from downstairs seemed to mock her, reminding her of what was to come. The days that followed were a silent torment. Charlotte went about her duties with the mechanical precision of an automaton. She watched Mr. Blackwood from afar, his imposing figure, his unchanging expression. He didn't seem to remember what he had said. To him, it was just another order, just another display of power. But to Charlotte, it was a sentence. She thought about running, about simply vanishing. But to where? And what would she leave behind? Her dignity, as hard as it was to maintain in that house, was something she wasn't willing to abandon. And an idea began to bloom in her mind, small at first, but gaining strength with every beat of her heart. If he wanted a spectacle, she would give him one, but not the kind he expected. She would play not for him, but for herself and for her grandmother. She would play the truth. The violin, once a hiding place, now seemed to have a new mission. It would not be defiled. It would become a vessel for something greater than humiliation. Charlotte practiced in secret, but now with a different purpose, no longer for solitary pleasure, but as a declaration. The notes rising from her violin in that small attic room were no longer just melancholy. They carried restrained fury, unshakable dignity, and the resilience of a soul that refused to be broken. She knew the performance would be for Mr. Blackwood, but she also knew that her true audience would be herself, and everyone who, like her, had ever been underestimated and silenced. The climax. The unexpected performance. The night of the dinner arrived beneath a heavy curtain of anticipation. The Blackwood dining hall glowed with an almost obscene brilliance, silver cutlery catching and warping the light of crystal chandeliers. The table, set for only a few, displayed unnecessary opulence. Plates Charlotte herself had helped prepare and serve, each arranged with a craftsmanship few would ever notice. The scent of rich food, mingled with the expensive perfumes of the guests, hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Charlotte moved among the guests, serving wine with mechanical precision, her mind focused not on the present, but on the moments to come. Her heart pounded erratically, a dull, relentless drum in her chest. Mr. Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his cold and imposing presence commanding the room. He smiled now and then at his guests, a smile that never reached his eyes. Charlotte felt his gaze land on her for a fleeting second, a barely perceptible nod that meant, "It's time." She stepped away from the table and walked into the adjacent sitting room where her violin was already waiting, strategically placed on a small pedestal, almost like a display piece. The instrument looked out of place in that meticulously luxurious setting, an organic soul among lifeless objects. As she approached, Charlotte felt a surge of strength. The violin, her confidant, her friend, would not be a stage for humiliation. It would be her voice. Silence fell over the dining hall. The murmurs ceased. The clinking of silverware stopped. Every eye turned toward Charlotte. Mr. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He expected hesitation, nervousness, perhaps even a flicker of shame. He expected a performance of patronizing entertainment. Charlotte took a deep breath. Her fingers, so intimately familiar with the strings, touched the polished wood of the violin. She closed her eyes for a moment, and in that instant, the grand hall, the haughty guests, the cold stare of Mr. Blackwood, all of it disappeared. She was no longer at Blackwood Manor. She was back on the porch with her grandmother, the sun warming her face, the scent of wet earth in the air. She was in an open field, beneath an endless sky, where her soul could dance freely. And then she played. The first note was not what they expected. It wasn't a melancholy lull, nor a hesitant melody. It was a cry of defiance, an ancestral lament that echoed through the walls, filling every corner of the vast hall. It was a melody that spoke of deep roots, of resistance, of an old pain that refused to be silenced. Each note was a heartbeat, a sigh, a story. The guests, once complacent, sat up straighter. The expectation of mockery on their faces gave way to surprise, and then to something deeper. Charlotte wasn't playing a lullaby. She was playing an epic. Her melody shifted, and with each measure she told a story without words. There was the bittersweet sweetness of childhood, the dreams born in forgotten communities, hope rising against all odds. Then the music changed into a pulsing rhythm of labor and struggle, the invisible sweat, the quiet strength of generations. The sound of her violin was the voice of her ancestors, the resilience threaded into every fiber of her soul. She wasn't playing for them, she was playing through them. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was true. It overflowed with sorrow, yes, but also with unshakable dignity, with a fierce beauty that could not be tamed. It was a silent protest, a bold affirmation of her humanity. Her eyes remained shut, her face a mask of intense focus, but her body swayed gently with the melody, in an intimate dance with the instrument. And at the center of it all, Mr. Blackwood was frozen. The smirk he expected to wear had vanished. He had set the stage for humiliation, but Charlotte had turned his demand into a revelation. The music struck him like lightning, cutting through the layers of ice he had built around himself. He didn't understand the words, there were no words, but he understood the emotion. The sound of Charlotte's violin wasn't the sound of a servant, it was the sound of an artist, of a soul. The melody stirred something dormant within him, a distant memory, a feeling he had long since buried beneath stacks of contracts and acquisitions. For one fleeting moment, he saw himself not as the untouchable tycoon, but as a man who had lost something essential. The melody Charlotte played evoked a deep melancholy, not of self-pity, but of unyielding strength. It was the song of someone who had been trampled but rose again, note after note. He felt a stab, not physical pain, but an unbearable remorse. It was the shame of his own cruelty, the incomprehension of his smallness in the face of the vast spirit Charlotte had just revealed. The hall was cloaked in a near sacred silence, broken only by the voice of Charlotte's violin. The guests exchanged glances, some pale-faced, others with eyes brimming with tears. They had come for a spectacle of mockery, but what they received was something entirely unexpected. The raw truth of the human soul, laid bare by a woman they had all underestimated. Charlotte opened her eyes at the end of the melody, the final note still vibrating in the air before fading into nothing. She didn't look at Mr. Blackwood, nor at the guests. Her gaze remained fixed on the violin, as if it were the true recipient of her gratitude and of her strength. The silence that followed wasn't the tense silence from before. It was a silence of awe, of stunned reverence. Then, one of the guests, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, began to clap. A hesitant applause at first, which quickly spread, growing in volume until it became a full ovation. Charlotte remained still, the violin still pressed against her shoulder, feeling the warmth of their hands. She knew the applause wasn't for her. It was for the music, for the truth she had dared to share. Mr. Blackwood remained motionless, his eyes locked on Charlotte. He was speechless, just as the evening's title had promised. But it wasn't the speechlessness of boredom or disdain. It was something far deeper: shock, shame, and a flicker of respect. The revelation and the consequence. The echo of the applause still lingered in the air, but Charlotte, now gently lowering her violin, remained wrapped in her own silence. She didn't feel euphoria, not even the bitter triumph she thought might come. There was only a strange sense of emptiness, as if she had poured out her soul and now stood at the mercy of whatever came next. The guests, once enthusiastic, began to disperse, some murmuring compliments, others avoiding her gaze, perhaps ashamed of their own anticipation of ridicule. Mr. Blackwood remained at the table, a statue of surprise and something more. His eyes, once cold and calculating, now seemed uncertain, almost vulnerable. He didn't clap, he didn't say a word, he just watched Charlotte, as if seeing her for the very first time. The posture that once radiated superiority was now slightly bent, his face contorted in an expression Charlotte couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger, nor disdain. It was a complex blend of shock, recognition, and perhaps a glimmer of regret. Charlotte braced herself for reprimand, for dismissal, for anything that might restore the order she had unintentionally disrupted. But his silence was heavier than any words. A chill ran down her spine. What would he do now? He, who had always seen her as an object, now looked at her as a person, an artist. And that new perception seemed to unmoor him completely. After the last guest left, the mansion fell silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the oppressive quiet from before, but a silence weighted with unspoken questions. Charlotte stood still, waiting. She knew he wouldn't let her leave without saying something. Finally, he rose. His steps were slow, hesitant as he approached her. Charlotte clutched the violin against her body like a shield. Mr. Blackwood stopped a few feet away, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes, revealing a depth she had never seen before. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low, hoarse. There was no trace of his usual authority, only an unexpected frailty. I wasn't expecting that." He paused, searching for words, something Charlotte never imagined he'd do. You're an artist, a true artist." The words fell like rain on parched ground. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement from the last person she ever expected it from. The gift she had given him wasn't something physical, it was a revelation. Her music had broken through his indifference, forcing him to see not a servant, but the dignity and strength of a soul. The gift was truth, humanity, the beauty he had tried to tarnish. Charlotte didn't respond. She simply looked at him, allowing the moment to unfold, letting the weight of her own art take hold. Mr. Blackwood sighed, a heavy, burdened sound. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, no longer demanding but genuinely curious. "My grandmother, sir," Charlotte finally said, her voice slightly thick with emotion. "She taught me." He nodded slowly. She would be proud. And then he said something that shocked her even more. I had a violin when I was a boy." His voice seemed to come from a distant place, from a memory nearly erased. "My father didn't approve, said it was a woman's thing, that men should focus on business." He looked down at his hands, large and strong, the hands of a magnate. "I sold it, a long time ago." It was a crack, a tiny opening in the fortress he had built. He had revealed himself, if only for a moment, as a human being, with wounds and regrets of his own. Charlotte's gift wasn't just music, it was connection. It was the recognition that, despite the vast gulf of status and power between them, there was a common thread of humanity, of loss, and of beauty that bound them.
"Charlotte," he began again, his voice firmer now, though layered with new respect. "You don't have to play in secret anymore. You may play whenever you wish, and—" he hesitated, searching for the right word. "I would like to hear you again, if you'd allow it." The phrase was an invitation, not a command. An invitation from a man who had once tried to humiliate her, but who now seemed to seek redemption, or at the very least, understanding. Charlotte didn't kneel. She didn't bow in thanks. Her victory wasn't measured in words or promises, but in the dignity she had never relinquished. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the dynamic between them had changed. She had been seen, and that was the greatest gift of all. The Blackwood mansion was no longer the same. Not physically, but in its atmosphere, something had shifted. The heavy curtain of oppressive silence that once suffocated Charlotte had been torn apart by the melody of her violin. From that night on, Charlotte's dignity was no longer a secret locked in the attic. It was a presence, visible, felt, woven into every corridor, every room of that grand structure. The change in Mr. Blackwood was subtle, but undeniable. He didn't become warm or approachable overnight. Coldness and austerity were ingrained too deeply to vanish completely. Yet the layer of indifference that once cloaked him had been pierced. He began to look at Charlotte with a different kind of respect, one that went beyond her efficiency as a maid. There was recognition in his eyes, recognition of her soul, of the artist he had once tried to diminish. His orders now carried a gentler tone, almost hesitant. Gone was the arrogance disguised as courtesy. He would often encounter Charlotte in the halls, and rather than brushing past her as if she were invisible, he paused. Sometimes he asked for news, small details about the day, something that once would have been unthinkable. And on occasion, Charlotte would hear him ask about the violin, about her music. It was a fragile thread of connection, but it was a connection, something that had never existed before. Charlotte, for her part, didn't take advantage of the new dynamic. She continued with her duties with the same dedication and professionalism, but now there was a lightness in her steps, a new conviction in her posture. The invisibility that once unsettled her had transformed into a form of power. She had been seen in her essence, and that was enough. The need to prove herself had vanished. Mr. Blackwood's promise that she could play was not a mere formality. Some nights, when the mansion had drifted into sleep and silence once again reigned, Charlotte would climb to the attic. But now, instead of hiding, she would open her bedroom window just slightly. The notes of her violin floated through the air, carried by the wind, spreading across the gardens, reaching the shuttered windows of the mansion's main wing. Mr. Blackwood listened. He would lie in bed as Charlotte's melodies wrapped around him, stirring something inside him that he couldn't quite name. It was a blend of melancholy and peace, a strange nostalgia for something he had never truly possessed or had lost long ago. It wasn't a formal concert, nor a request on his part. It was a silent offering of beauty, a form of communication that transcended social barriers and years of indifference. Charlotte didn't play to shame him or remind him of what he had done. She played because it was who she was, and now she had the freedom to be. And Mr. Blackwood listened because that music, so full of life and dignity, was a mirror of the humanity he had long suppressed within himself. Charlotte's life at the mansion, though still that of a servant, was now filled with new meaning. She was no longer just a doer of tasks. She was the keeper of a melody that had touched a hardened soul. She knew her art, her voice, had fulfilled a purpose greater than mere entertainment. It had met humiliation with beauty. It had answered indifference with the depth of the soul. What did the future hold for Charlotte? Perhaps she would find a new path, a place where her music could bloom freely, where her art would be celebrated without restraint. Perhaps the Blackwood mansion would become, for her, a place of transition, a launching point towards something greater. What was certain was that she was no longer the same Charlotte who had once arrived there, a shadow among shadows. She was the woman whose melody had broken the silence, the woman whose dignity had left a magnate speechless. Charlotte's story, and that of her violin, was in the end an ode to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that true wealth lies not in possessions or power, but in the dignity one preserves, in the art one expresses, and in the ability to touch, even for a fleeting moment, another soul. The music, her voice, had transcended the walls of the Blackwood mansion and left an indelible mark not only on Mr. Blackwood, but on Charlotte herself, who now knew, with unwavering certainty, that her inner melody could never be silenced. She was living proof that art, in its purest and truest form, can be the most powerful gift of all, capable of inspiring, healing, and sometimes even transforming the coldest of hearts.